make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so ethnic loneliness, the way I define it in the book is that you are ethnically lonely, or you are feeling a sense of loneliness or not belonging or disbelonging, a sense of alienation as a direct result of your ethnic and racial identity. That is what's causing your sense of disbelonging and alienation. It's your ethnic and racial identity. It's separating you into this different kind of group. You're being isolated, marginalized. And so there are so many results of that. There's so many ramifications of being separated and somewhat exiled. I also use the term exile because of your ethnicity and your race.
Hello and welcome to Faithful Politics. If you're joining us via YouTube for our viewers and listeners, if you're joining us on the podcast, this is Josh Burtram. I'm your faithful host. Our political host, Will Wright, couldn't join us on this episode today, but we have the distinct privilege of interviewing Prasanta Verma, who has an MBA and an MPH, Masters of Public Health. She was born under an Asian sun, raised in the Appalachian foothills, and currently resides in the Midwest. Her work has been published in Sojourners, the Curator Magazine, and the Indianapolis Review, Relief Journal, the Mudroom Blog, Guideposts, Pray a Word a Day, and others. In addition to writing, Prasanta served as a speech and debate coach for 10 years. When she's not writing or working, she's drinking chai and reading a good book. Prasanta lives in Wisconsin with her family, and today we are interviewing her about her latest book, Beyond Ethnic Loneliness, through IVP Press, The Pain of Marginalization and the Path to Belonging. Prasanta, thank you so much for coming on the show and spending some time with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh.
Yeah, so I got to ask, for people that haven't been able to read the book or may not be aware, kind of tell us about your story. I gave a little bit of a preview there, but I love born under an Asian sun, raised in the Appalachian foothills, and currently resides in the Midwest. That is a broad spectrum of places. Kind of talk to me about that. What's your journey been like to this point?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, great question. So born under an Asian sun, I was actually born in India. And when I was 1 year old, my parents immigrated to the United States. So they came to the United States. It was a few years after the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which opened the door for immigrants from Asia and Africa. So they were some of those early waves that came after that act, a few years after that act was passed. So we came to the United States, and then 30 days after landing, my sister was born. So my mom had me, my sister, she didn't speak English, and my dad had a job waiting for him. And he came because they wanted people who were educated. And so he was a medical doctor. So they welcomed him and, opened the doors for him to come. Lived a few different places, and eventually ended up in a small town in rural Alabama. And so that's where I grew up. And that is actually in the foothills of the Appalachians. And in our little town, there's hills that surround the town. And so those are just like the very ending of the Appalachian Mountains.
Right. That's amazing. So I know when I was reviewing your book and looking through it, you kind of talk about that experience, right, of growing up in the Appalachian foothills in Alabama. Kind of talk to us a little bit about that. What was that like growing up in a small town in Alabama? Actually, my dad's family is from Alabama, so I have roots that go there. People, relatives, distant relatives, right, who fought in the Civil War on the losing side, in the Confederate side of the Civil War. So I have deep roots in the South and understand kind of the racism and everything that can be involved in all of that. What was that like for you growing up there as someone who was born under an Asian sun living in those foothills?
Yeah, that is a great question. So when we moved to this small town, we were the first Indian immigrant family and the only one within 45-minute radius.
Wow.
So going to school, I was the only one who looked like me. There was no other Asian Indian. In fact, there weren't that very many Asians either. And except for my sister and I, and my brother actually went to a different school, but we were the only ones in our school and the first students that others had seen from India. So here we were growing up, and like the first Asian Indian immigrants in this small town. So in the book, I share some stories, some specific things that happened, some specific incidents. And one of them was, I start off the book with a story of being on the playground as a kid and having one of the other kids turn to me and say, go back to where you came from, to Indiana or wherever it is you came from.
Oh, my word.
And she didn't even know like the name of the country, India. It's just, she said Indiana. And so I start that off, right away with, that was the moment when I realized, wow, that was a turning point for me in my life because I never forgot it. It was the first time, wouldn't be the last time, but that somebody actually pointed out to me what was different about me, why I looked different. And all of a sudden I was very much aware of it to a degree I had never been before.
Yeah, that's so difficult. It sounds like that was like a core memory that you had that was very much there in kind of like shaping your identity. How did that shape your identity as you moved forward? How did that experience connect? Like, what did that do to you?
Yeah, I think it's a core memory. And I didn't realize that until years and years later. And when I started as an adult, started processing through some of these things, because I had kind of stuffed it away. I didn't tell anybody that she had said this to me. I didn't talk about it or even cry about it. I just kind of moved on. And I think now that I've had, some years behind me and I have a chance to think back, I think it was part of the assimilation that we were doing, that my parents were doing. You just kind of take it in and move on. But I think it definitely had a profound impact on my identity. Because all of my life, I've been asking myself that question. So what am I and who do I want to be? Do I want to be this Indian person or not? And not that I had a choice for some of it, but, it definitely it was a core question that I wrestled with for most of my life. And hence in this book, there's a phrase that I refer to often, which is, so what are you? That came straight from that experience of somebody asking me, so, what are you? Who are you? Not really who are you? So what are you? Which is a different kind of question.
Yeah.
So, it definitely impacted me for the rest of my life because I was trying to answer that question for myself.
Man, that is so profound. I'm really sorry that happened. I'm sorry that people, in their ignorance and their anger and whatever was going on inside of them that would lead them to treat others that way. I don't claim to know exactly why, but that's terrible. One of the things you bring out is this concept. It's in the title of your book, is ethnic loneliness. And I'm sure that many people could define ethnic, they could define loneliness, but then bringing those two things together, trying to understand those, maybe they might come up with a concept that might be different or might be the same as what you're talking about. Help us understand, what is ethnic loneliness and how does that affect the person who's experiencing it?
Yeah, so ethnic loneliness, the way I define it in the book is that you are ethnically lonely, or you are feeling a sense of loneliness or not belonging or disbelonging, a sense of alienation as a direct result of your ethnic and racial identity. That is what's causing your sense of disbelonging and alienation. It's your ethnic and racial identity. It's separating you into this different kind of group. You're being isolated, marginalized. And so there are so many results of that. There's so many ramifications of being separated and somewhat exiled. I also use the term exile because of your ethnicity and your race. And the reason that I think it came out, another reason I want to share is, so a few years ago, the Surgeon General declared that we are living in an epidemic of loneliness.
Wow.
And that is all around. That is everybody, all races, everybody, and for various reasons. And I started thinking about this because I wanted to understand, what does that mean for the minority population? How is this impacting the ethnic and racial minority? Because we're already experiencing this sense of disconnection, isolation from each other. And it is impacting the minority person at a different level and different layers. Because we're already being somewhat isolated and marginalized. But now you add also this on, it's extra. So I wanted to explain what is happening to the ethnic and racial minority and how is it impacting this group.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, Josh Burtram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight. Man, that's fascinating. You know, I grew up in Northern Virginia, so I don't know how much interaction you've had with Northern Virginia, but it's very diverse. And actually, Southeast Asian is one of the largest populations in Northern Virginia. And the place where I live now, outside of Richmond, it's the same thing. Many of my neighbors are from India. Many of my friends are from India. And so thinking about like the story of you being the only person with your complexion, the only person with your ethnic identity within like a large radius, it's almost incomprehensible to me. The only thing I came close to is when I lived out in the Midwest, but even that wasn't nearly what you're talking about. And I can imagine that being very, very difficult to be like this, almost like this siloed group where you only have each other. I got to ask, what did that do with your family? Like, how did that connect you guys? Did it make you closer? Did it create tension? Did it create closeness? Both? And what was that like for you guys having to grow up? Because I'm assuming you had a very different experience than your parents, similar, but different because you're a child, right? And you're trying to make sense of the world, and they've already had a culture that they had growing up and now bringing it here. What was that like?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, you living in this area, I was always so jealous. Like I wanted to move to where, you know, and
I'm
whenever
sure you
I
did.
would so whenever we would actually in later years, we'd visit places like your area, I'd look around, like people walking around the street, and I would see, you know, South Asians, and I would see people from everywhere, and I think, man, this is great. I love this. So yeah, I love hearing that story that you shared about where you live. Completely different scenario where I grew up in South Central Alabama, North Central Alabama. So, yeah, there was nobody like me growing up. Like there was nobody else I could go talk to and say, hey, is it like this for you too? You know, what is it like for you? So my siblings and I were the only ones that we had. You know, we were just assimilating. We were just trying to fit in. I wanted to be like everyone else. I wanted to look like everyone else, talk like everyone else. And especially like as teens, you know, that's kind of like what you do.
Yeah.
You're going to fit in with your peers. And so that's where I was. And I actually was ashamed of, and I'm ashamed to say this, but I was ashamed of my background. I didn't want to be from where I was from. I wanted to be American. I wanted to be white American. And so it was for me, when I grew up and got older and I matured and I started to really appreciate my past and my background. And when I started to actually learn more about my culture and my background, my ethnicity, and started to appreciate it and enjoy it, celebrate it, accept it, all of those things. So I am sorry to say that that was how I was when I was younger. I wanted nothing to do with India. So my parents would try to, encourage me to learn the language, or I have wanted nothing to do with it. I wanted to reject it. I rejected things that were from India. And so that was kind of like my survival. That was our survival. And we assimilated very well, our family. And we each have our own unique stories about that, about our experiences. We each have commonalities of what we went through, and we each have our own unique experiences too. If you talk to, every member of my family, they will give you their own stories of what it was like for them. But there was that common thread of, we are immigrants here. We are immigrants. And back then, for my parents, it was, for them, it was trying not to make a fuss. It was trying to fit in, and you just got through it. You got through things and you tried not to make a fuss about it.
Do you feel like, and I'm sure in your experience in writing the book, in the different people that you've talked to, is this a common experience that you have with, say, first generation immigrants, that they are trying to, connect and not make a fuss, and then they see in their children a kind of pushing away or anger? I mean, I'm assuming that is a common experience, but I don't know. How has your studies, how has this experience informed that?
Yeah, I think it is a common experience from the people that I've talked to. Anecdotally, there was that same kind of rebellion of, I don't want to have anything to do with India. However, I will say, and that was true of my generation, but this generation I think is different. I think there is more, because our parents started, they started it and they went through it. And I feel like for us, we don't have the same environment is there that we have to feel like we have to assimilate. I think that there are other options now. I think there's more conversation now. There's more awareness now. And there's more people now. So I think it's a little of a different story for say my children than it is for me.
Sure.
So for sure, I think there is a difference. It doesn't mean that, though, everything, of course, we've solved it. We've solved everything and they can show up and be themselves. I think we still have work to do, but there is definitely a change from what it was to what it is now.
Yeah. Like imagine when you were a little girl, if there was a podcast that you could have listened to where someone named Prasanta could come on and talk about their experience, right? I mean,
exactly.
that would have been way different. So I got to ask, like you had mentioned before, loneliness. We're in an epidemic of loneliness. How does ethnic loneliness compare to, say, typical loneliness? What are kind of the attributes of loneliness? And then how does the ethnic part of it color loneliness in its own particular way? How does it differ from other forms? And then even taking that a step further, like why does it make it so our society, our faith communities, they need to recognize this distinction?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So one of the things I think that is unique about ethnic loneliness is that with ethnic loneliness, there is this sense of being a perpetual foreigner. And so what I mean by perpetual foreigner is that, we look different. We don't match white majority culture. So we look different. Maybe our culture is different. We have different values, customs, or our skin color is different ways of talking, different ways of looking. And so there's this sense of, because we don't fit into that that definition of what is normal of white majority culture, that we are consistently considered as outsiders. So no matter how long we've lived here, whether we can go back generations or whether we've been here one generation, there is, because of that, we are viewed as foreigners. And it's a consistent view of, okay, well, you look different, so you're not from here. So what are we defining as being here? What are we defining as being this country, right? So there's that sense of being perpetually foreign, that we will be seen in whatever space we're in, that we are being kind of identified as not being from here or belonging here. It's a sense of belonging. So related to perpetual foreigner is that sense of belonging. Do I feel as an ethnic minority that I am going to belong here? Do I feel that I'm going to belong in this space? When I walk into this classroom, when I walk into this workplace, when I walk into my place of worship, am I going to feel that sense of belonging, that I belong here? And so there's that also that tension of wanting to belong, feeling like you belong, but not always belonging. And sometimes you belong and sometimes you don't. Because sometimes our culture says you belong and sometimes it says you don't belong. And it could be related to something happening in the world, some politics. It could be related to, events that are going on. And we can name a few of them and as examples. Right. Or it just could be that sense of each space is different. And we don't know when walking into that space how we will be perceived and will we be welcome. So there's this sense of wanting this perpetual welcome, perpetual sense of belonging, perpetual sense of feeling like, oh, I'm at home here. As opposed to, though, experiencing that it is not that way. So that is how I would define ethnic loneliness as being different from the other kinds of loneliness that we feel, which is a disconnection, a lacking of community, or it's more than solitude. It's being, separated and not being in community with other people. So there are some unique aspects of ethnic loneliness also, and that these are just a few. There's more.
Sure. Yeah. I'm a pastor, and so I'm fascinated by this idea of how do we minister to people in the ethnic community, especially, and I'm thinking in particular in this question, the immigrant community. I have a lot of friends that are from India. And of course, India is an extremely diverse country. Maybe people look similar to white people. They might look similar, but it's an extremely diverse country. And it doesn't take more than 5 minutes of really listening in a conversation with someone who is from India or whose parents were from India to realize the diversity there. And I'm always wondering, like, how can I create at my church a place where someone who is from India or that's their cultural heritage, their ethnic heritage. Well, I'm just using India as the example, right? Because we've been talking about that, and that happens to be your particular cultural heritage. But how do we create a space where someone can feel like they do belong, like they can belong? Is it music? Is it just smiling and being nice? And I'm not trying to be cute here. I'm really curious. How do you create a space where that can happen? What has been your experience? What kind of suggestions would you give me to create a space where people would feel like they belong?
Yeah, that's a hard question, but I mean, I honestly don't feel like I have the answers or I'm equipped to answer. I can share some things that might be helpful to think about.
Yeah.
So I think that a church is a wonderful place and provides a place for social connection for people. So we have these places, we have these churches in our communities. They can be wonderful centers of connection among all kinds of people. So one thing we can ask ourselves, well, is how can my church be this place of connection in my community? How can I make it that way? And sometimes it's it's not just maybe coming to a service, but it may be just having a special event. So it could be an event to celebrate a culture, opening up your space to celebrate the unique cultures of the people around you, making that space, making it a place of dialogue. What about a place of interfaith dialogue with the people in your community? So it can be a place, a center of connection, communication, dialogue, and celebration. It can be all of those things. So I think that is like almost like taking a step forward, and inviting people in, but inviting them to come in as they are, and inviting them to share about themselves in this space because hey, we're saying we're curious. We love you. We are curious about you. We want to know about you. How can we love you in this space that we have? And so asking ourselves, what can we do in our communities, in the church? But what also, like, how can we be going out? What can we be doing by going out in our communities? And, it is not necessarily a place of comfort or ease. It's not easy. It's awkward. It may feel uncomfortable, but you know what? Isn't that what Jesus did? He went out
it is.
and did that. He didn't go where it was comfortable or easy. So he kind of showed us by example, like he went to those people that were different or outcast or on the outside, and just offered them a welcome and a place of belonging. So I think that, but I also think, like the leadership, like your pastor. So what is the leadership? Like, what is the commitment from leadership? What are they saying about it? Are they talking about it? Are they making it a priority? Is it intentional? Are they bringing in the voices from the community or the marginalized voices? Are they asking themselves, okay, what voice is missing from this conversation?
Oh,
whose voice is missing here? So those are things, maybe, I don't know, as a pastor, maybe, like,
that's a
what
great
do you
question.
think?
I mean, that's an amazing question. Like, what voice is missing from, from this conversation? And I think that's absolutely fascinating. It's hard because we're a pretty small church, but we're pretty diverse. But what we're not diverse in, which I want to be more diverse in, is in someone like in Southeast Asian diversity, because our community has so many people. Now, many of them are Hindu. Nearly all of my friends that are from India are Hindu, and I've invited them to come. So one thing that we've done is we actually have meals before we have our service. We eat together every time we gather, and it's a lot, and it takes a lot. But I've tried to invite my friends, my Indian friends, to those, and they've been very responsive. They even stayed for the service. I've told them, you don't have to stay, if it's not something that you're comfortable with, okay. But they've stayed. They asked me questions. I had a conversation after one of the services where they were explaining to me the Trinity, the Hindu Trinity, which I had never heard of before. But and I wish I remember the names, but there are several gods that essentially in some way correlated with Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And it was fascinating. And I had to let go of, like, hey, I need to convert them. Right. I had and that's hard with how I've grown up. It's hard with how I've not like my parents. That's not what I mean. Just the culture and Christianity, and trying to figure out evangelism in our culture, and in a very pluralistic culture is not easy. It's the hardest thing that we are facing, I feel like, is how do we bring evangelism out in a way that respects the person, respects where they've come from, but at the same time is trying to bring the truth of Jesus Christ in a way that makes sense. So that's been difficult, but it has to be. I know one thing for sure is I can't give up on trying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I can't give up on trying. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say in response. I didn't really have a question there, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on any and all of that I mentioned.
Yeah. Okay. So I grew up in the South in the Bible Belt. I actually grew up going to a Southern Baptist church.
Nice.
Which I don't go to, which I can't, I am actually have to be separated from that right now. I mean, I'm not part of that anymore. Years ago. Okay.
Sure.
But growing up in the Southern Baptist church, there was the emphasis on evangelism and being saved. And then that was it, right? I would say if there was a weakness, it was discipleship and training and stuff. But, years later, after I moved out and I'm no longer a part of that denomination, and you've had guests on to talk about things going on right now with bigger issues related to that white nationalism and such.
And you can say whatever you want, Prasanta, on this podcast. You don't have to. I mean, you can censor or you can say whatever you want. It's all up to you.
Yeah. So basically, I have separated myself from that. Okay. That denomination, but that was long before any of this happened. It was a lot of things, and there's been a lot of detangling and deconstruction happening because of some of the teachings.
Sure.
But I would say that American evangelicalism, my exposure to it, and this emphasis on conversion, as opposed to what does it mean to love our neighbor, right? And also I think that there's been such an emphasis on the individualized response to the gospel. Like it's such your individual response when you read scripture, it's actually in the original language. It's not just you, it's you all. I mean,
y'all.
It's a
that was a good one there.
You all, y'all. It's y'all, you all. So I think that the way that we have internalized and taught, and the way that the culture has responded, I think it's somewhat, in some ways, been harmful. In some ways, it's not maybe helpful. But maybe we can think about, what does it mean? What does it actually mean now to reach people? Because whatever it has been, in some ways, was not working.
Right.
So, and I think that, the emphasis on conversion in particular and on numbers, sometimes it becomes about numbers. It becomes about the growth.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I know. I think that there's so many things we can look at, and it's a hard thing to answer, to know, like, what is the right thing to do? What is the right answer? But, yeah, I have my own, I'm doing like my own internal dealings with all of that too, like from my growing up years as well. And what I think now, and the way that I've changed, and the way that I understand scripture now too. So it's definitely been a journey.
Oh, absolutely. And I know you outline in your book some of the historical injustices that have been faced by various ethnic groups, certainly worldwide, certainly in America. How do you see these kind of past injustices? How do you see these past injustices influence the present experience of ethnic minorities, those who are immigrants to our country? How do you see the ripple effects, or maybe it's beyond ripple effects? Maybe it's more seismic connection. I don't know what to say. How do you see it affecting the experience of ethnic minorities today in our communities and in our churches?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's for sure there are effects of these historical injustices. So, for example, one of the questions that I asked, I don't know if I actually put this question in my book. I don't think I wrote it. I think I had it originally and maybe I took it out. But the question is, why? This is a question I've heard other people ask. Why are we always talking about race? Why do we have to talk about it?
Absolutely.
And so there's that question that comes up regularly. Why? Why do we talk about it? And it is because, for example, let's take slavery, because Black people they can't not talk about it. They can't not think about it. it's part of their identity and who they are. And there's also, there's this whole new study of epigenetics, which tells us that our genes are actually altered by some of the events of our past.
Yes.
So there are so many direct links as to why it's affecting us today. And we can't erase ourselves from it because it's part of us, and it's part of our history. We can't ignore it. Like the indigenous population, they can't ignore that. They can't ignore what's happened to them. It's part of them. And I just have to say, Josh, like I was one of the ones I also had that personal transformation in my life because I used to think that too. I used to think, why are we always talking about race? And I had to go through my own personal journey of understanding that myself, because I also, even though I had my own stories to tell, my own discriminations and aggressions that have happened to us and our family, I still had to ask that question. Why are we talking about it? What is it? What systemic injustice? What are you talking about? I had to go through that and understand it for myself. And that required me looking beyond my own viewpoint. It required me genuinely trying to understand the other person's viewpoint, reading other people's perspectives and points of view in their own voice, and just getting out of my own echo chamber, because I felt like I was in an echo chamber, especially in the South where I grew up. I felt like I was in a bit of a bubble. So I had to get out of that. And I had to get out of that. I didn't know I had to get out of it, but to get out of it,
Right.
actually, I had to, it required reading. It required reading multiple perspectives, points of view, and, prayer. It required, opening myself up to the possibility that there are other viewpoints are right. So it's a journey, and I was transformed.
It is a journey, and I feel like I've been on the same journey in a different way, right?
Yeah.
Obviously growing up, wondering the same kinds of questions, but then having my own white identity, and then feeling, even coming into this, like, well, am I privileged? I don't feel privileged, but I guess I am. There must be, it makes sense. Like if I think about the experience of other people, my peers that are not white, I'm thinking, well, I guess I need to listen to their experiences and realize myself in comparison. I mean, I am privileged. Maybe I did get, the advantage and certain advantages that others didn't. And trying to wrestle through my own sense of guilt about, my ancestors and what they were like, and how even my own grandparents, how they felt, the kinds of things I would hear said around the dinner table that I very much internalized as a little kid. And again, it wasn't my parents even as much as their parents, and many of the things that I heard from them, and trying to reconcile, because I never felt like, I was like, no, I don't have any racism. I never felt like, oh, I'm not racist. But then when I started looking at some of what that meant and some of my own prejudices, then I had to be honest. And that was a tough experience in my own life, of trying to work through what it means to be white in the 21st century, with all of the history that has been there, of which I have zero control. I only can control the things that I'm doing in the ways that I'm teaching my children. And, and I can imagine humanity being in a, when I think about Christianity, it was a religion that started in the Middle East, right? And now it has become, in this predominant sense, at least in the Western world, a white religion, right? And thinking about this, like, I'm sure that there is tension here. And how did your faith and your experience of faith, how did these two things, I don't want to say collide, but how did they interact? Your faith on the one hand, and you can share whatever it is you want about your own faith journey, and the identity you have, and learning to not just accept that identity, but to love it, to embrace it. Maybe even and I think about, I'm sure the collisions that you faced with this predominantly Christian, white Christian, society, that created its own set of questions and tensions. And you mentioned deconstruction. How have you kind of pulled these threads? Where has it brought you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a sense, it's still growing, and threads are still being pulled. But I can definitely share. So I actually grew up. My parents are Hindu, so I grew up with Hindu parents, but they actually took us to church.
Really?
So everywhere we lived, we went to church, because a lot of Hindus believe in every god. So they believe,
Right.
Jesus is one of the gods, and and going to church was good. It was a good thing. It was a place where you could get good morals and good teaching. So we went to church everywhere. And so I actually grew up going to church, even though my parents were Hindu. So in the South, we ended up going to church. But, like my counterparts when I was growing up that grew up in Fremont or Chicago or New Jersey, they were going to the Hindu temple on Sundays. I was actually going to church.
Wow.
So, I actually, that's where I became a believer, was going to church. And even though my parents eventually stopped going, I actually wanted to keep going. And so they let me keep going, even though after a while it was a little bit difficult, but they did let me keep going, and they respect it. So I was, I grew up, in a different way. I grew up with, that tension of a different cultural belief, different religious beliefs too in my household. And so for me, growing up, when I was younger, I was mad at God. Because I was mad at God because I asked God, why did you make me look this way if you wanted me to live in America and fit in as an American? So I was actually, I had to reconcile that. And so that took some time. That took actually years of reconciliation of me. And eventually to the place where I actually, to the point now where, and I had to go through my own healing, and, it was the spiritual healing and such, but to the point where today I now am in a place where I celebrate it. I love it. I accept it, but it's more than just acceptance. I celebrate it, and I accept it with joy. It's I love that. And I celebrate that there are so many different kinds of ethnicities and cultures and people from all backgrounds. I love that. So it was a personal transformation in my life. I had internalized racism, and I didn't have the term for it back then, but I had internalized it because I thought that who I wasn't good enough, and it was wrong, and it was a mistake. And so I grew up with that. And I think many people of color have that. We have that sense of internalized racism where we reject our own selves, and we think that we are less than. And that's a tragedy. That is a tragedy. So,
Yes.
and we're good working through it, right? People are working through it. So anyway, that was a little bit of my background and how, my faith was actually part of my healing. It was between me and God, and a wrestling I had to do with between me and God about that particular issue.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You think about the gospel, right? And the whole idea with the gospel is that you belong, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're a child of God. God cares for you. And then you have the tension of, I belong. God made me. He made me unique. I'm made in his image. He loves me. All these various things, right? And then on the other side, this sense of, but then it doesn't feel like my experience in this culture is reinforcing that, but rather it's creating a tension in that. It's almost telling me the opposite of that. And
it just reminds me also. I'm just reminded of the song that we sang when we were kids, in VBS and Sunday school. Jesus loves the little children, red and yellow, black and white. They are precious in his sight. We sing that song as children. All little children growing up in church sing that song. So what happened though? What happens though after that? What happened? So there was something that happened. Those little children that we all sang that song, and not all of them. I mean, not all of them, but what happened with some, right?
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is a fascinating question. It's a key question. And, I imagine that the role of community in your healing and moving to, and I'm hearing from you that this healing is still happening, right? It's this process that is still ongoing. But how has the community around you helped and or hindered that sense of healing and helping the feeling of ethnic loneliness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think it's just when I say that healing is still happening, I think there's just a process of continuing to learn and grow. Like I'm constantly
Right.
learning and growing and learning so much. Like 10 years from now, 5 years from now, I'll keep, learning. But the role of community, I think one of the things I think is super important is that we all have a safe place to land. We all have safe community. We have a place where we feel like we can be ourselves, where we feel like we belong, and we feel loved unconditionally, that no matter what, there's somebody who loves us. And I think that a faith community and a church community, a small group, they can provide that. And so it's at different levels too. So there's, our church community. I think there's also, like, for me, having friends who are from India too, who can relate with me on a different level about being from India and my cultural things and things we can laugh about that other people may not understand or totally get, right? So I think there's different kinds of safe community that we can have, but it for sure is something that we all need, and we need to have that in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all about that and the importance of community. I was thinking how important is it that you have diversity within your healing community?
Yeah.
Like, I guess I'm imagining, like, how important is it to have white people in the community? I'm not saying that just because, like, is there a healing element because of the pain that's been caused by certain white people in someone's life, where having another person who's white come in and love them in a different way would be a unique kind of healing? I mean, I don't want to get too weird with it, but does that make sense? Does the question make sense? How important is it?
Yeah, I think it
to have
depends
that
on-
diversity.
I think it's a great question. And I think it is important. And I think it depends on the person and their experiences. Some of my closest friends are white people. And some of my best girlfriends are white people. They're white girls, they're my white girlfriends. So, I mean, that's just the way it is. I didn't plan for it. That's the way it is.
Sure.
And also because exposure, like I don't have a lot of Indian people near me in where I live. So, but absolutely, I think that having that friendship with someone, a white person or a person of another culture, is definitely healing. I'm just reminded of the story of, there's this man, he's in Maryland, and he goes to the Ku Klux Klan. He's a black man, and I can't think of his name at the moment.
Yes. I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
He goes and he just goes and it's their first experience of a friendship with a black man. And I think, oh, how healing is that? How healing to have someone reach out to you in a friendly way, and he's taking a huge risk, but how healing it must be for both sides.
Absolutely. I mean, I can only imagine the discomfort and then pushing through that, and what that does and how that develops, you as you're working through that. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. And I think we need more like that. One of the things that you talk about in the book are the gifts of ethnic minorities, and there being unique gifts that they bring to communities and to the world. What are some of the examples that of the gifts that you were thinking in particular, and how do they reflect God's character?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the things that I mentioned in the book is the appreciation that we have for other cultures and perspectives and people different from us. Is it maybe a failure to recognize the complexity of God? Because God created all of us. And so what is it? What is it about all of these different ethnic groups? Why? Why? Obviously here we are. God must have wanted it to be like this. So here we are, we exist. I think there's so many. I think one of the things I talk about is hospitality. Hospitality is just something that other cultures value, and it's something that we can learn from each other, but just different viewpoints, perspectives. When it comes to for example, reading scripture. Okay, how is this how are these people in Korea reading the scripture versus people in Ghana reading the scripture and the Middle East reading the scripture? So there's all these different perspectives, and you learn so much by the way that they read a certain passage, and then we read it because we're reading it with different viewpoints. So many things that we can learn from each other. Our different perspectives, different cultural values, unique ways of thinking. Just because we all grow up in different places, we bring some kind of uniqueness to the way that we see the world, and we can share that with each other. Because I don't necessarily know how. I think I learned so much from another person. I can't necessarily see every side of an issue or perspective. I need that other person to tell me, "Oh, have you thought about it this way? Have you considered this?" There's such a richness in the diversity of our perspectives that we bring to each other in conversation and being community with each other, that it says, and a synergy, right? That we can't do it by ourselves, or if we're with people that are always like us.
So on your journey and understanding ethnic loneliness and bringing this out for other people to understand, to see, to grapple with, what were some pivotal moments on the journey, maybe moments of clarity, moments of insight where you felt like, oh, I get it now? What were some of those pivotal moments on this journey that helped you move forward, that you could share, and that other people listening this could either use in their own lives, that could connect to something in their own life? Like, oh yeah, that makes sense, or I felt the same way, or I'm close to that kind of thing, or it could even help someone be more empathetic to others that might be going through something similar, or going through something like ethnic loneliness. Because I can think of people in my life, friends, that would feel ethnic loneliness, and it would help them to understand some of those pivotal moments, and it helps me to understand how to be more empathetic for how this might help them, and I could even share this with them. I'm even thinking of people that I want to talk to and share the podcast and even the book with.
Yeah, I think a turning point that happened to me in my life was so I was a debate coach for 10 years. You mentioned that. What I would teach my students was, when you're a debate student, you have to learn both sides of an issue really, really well. You have to learn the pro and the con, because when you're in a tournament and you go into a debate round, you're either going to be presenting the pro side or the con side, and you have to know both sides. So you don't know, you're going to be thrust into that situation. So it doesn't matter what you personally believe at that moment. That's
fascinating.
You have to be either advocating for the pro or the con. So you need to know both sides very, very well. And a lot of people think debate is about arguing and everything. And I could tell you, debate is not that. Debate is really about knowing both sides of an argument and actually finding common ground. And a lot of people don't think that's what debate is, but that is what debate really is. So you have know both sides of an argument. And so I was convicted. Here I was, a debate teacher and a debate coach. But I realized in my own life that I had not applied that to certain parts of my beliefs in my life. I realized I had not applied that to what was happening in broader culture. And so that was one thing that happened to me, was I realized I had not been doing that. I was not considering all sides of the issue. I believed one side, my own side. And the other thing was like
Sure.
the political events, 2016 and then George Floyd and everything happening all at once. Really, it just forced me to reckon with all of a sudden, I didn't feel safe in my country. All these years, I felt like, I mean, even though I'd had things happen in my life, I had felt such at that time so unsettled in my own country. Like I felt personally attacked by our, presidential candidate who didn't want me here. I felt like I wasn't wanted here. And I had never felt that kind of personal attack before from a political person who didn't even know me. But it was very interesting and a very unique situation to be in and to feel like this. So,
Wow.
So feeling like that whole experience also took me on this journey of, my goodness, all of a sudden I felt worried. I felt like I needed to carry my passport with me everywhere I went. I had never felt that way before. Yeah, that's how I felt. So that was my personal experience was what was happening in our country and how it was affecting me and my life, my sense of belonging in this country. And so it was a huge, huge thing that I had to reckon with. So that was a turning point for me. So those were very personal things that happened in my life that set me on this journey of reconciling with my ethnic identity, because I had kind of like, I was realizing there was this internal conversation in my head that I believed white was superior. And
Wow.
I just lived with that. And I just kind of had settled into this kind of living with that thought in my head. And it had been there for so long that I just lived with it. But now all of a sudden I had to like come to a reckoning with that. So it was a very personal journey for me too.
Wow.
But while the nation was going through that, I was also going through my own personal journeys. And I think that's true for a lot of people.
I think it is.
What was happening in our country was deeply affecting people on a personal level. And to me personally, in a way that I had never been affected in my life before.
That is, I mean, a couple things come to mind. One, I'm so sorry that you felt that way. I mean, I just think about my friends that I have and to imagine that they felt that way. And I think they did. Like, I don't know. It's just terrible. Like this country that you grew up in, that you love, this is your country. And it's like to feel that way. I couldn't even imagine feeling that way.
Well, think about other people who were directly attacked. I mean, people who were like, think about, okay, after 9/11, we had Sikhs who had been here for several generations because they came earlier, even before they were attacked because people thought they looked Muslim because they wore a turban on their head, right? So they also, like, they experienced that. And then, like, during the pandemic, we had Chinese Americans. Chinese Americans have also been here, many of them, for generations. And then all of a sudden they were attacked. They were singled out. If you looked Chinese American, you were targeted. So you all of a sudden became hyper visible. You became visible in a sense where you didn't want to be visible. So it happened in different ways for different groups of people and different levels. So I think we each have our own unique experience with it.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think you're right. That has been a lot of people's experience. So this is kind of my last big question. And then I'll ask just some practical questions on how people can follow you and things like that. So looking into the future, what are you hopeful for? And what are you anxious about moving into the future? Maybe anxious, I don't know what word you want to use, but what are you hopeful for? And what are you also concerned? That's a better way. Concerned about looking into the future, thinking about this election season, thinking about beyond this election season, and just be as transparent as you feel like you can. What are you hopeful for and what are you concerned about? Yeah.
Well, you mentioned this election season. That is a concern because we're seeing a repeat of some of the same, the candidate is the same that we had that started this journey for me back, 8 years ago. So that is a concern. That is a concern for me. And I'm being as transparent as I can be about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then what do I hope for, though? What I hope for is that I would really love to normalize conversation about loneliness and about belonging.
Yeah.
And let's talk about it. Let's bring it out in the open. I would love to see it destigmatized. Loneliness is something that we all experienced at some point in our lives in some way or another. I think
Yes.
most of us are familiar with that feeling. And I would love to see us move towards normalizing conversation about it and talking about it and addressing it, because I think it is a big problem in our society, the way, for many, many reasons. So that's what I would love to see. That's my hope, that we can move toward there and work toward alleviating that loneliness.